doubt. We all have it. But what do we do with it? Maybe you were raised as a Christian, but you haven't darkened the door of a church building in quite some time. Maybe you had a painful experience that makes trusting in God just seem so inadequate. Maybe you've read and studied your way out of and you feel like you've grown past religion and its claims. I want to invite you to join us on a journey as we ask the question, is faith credible? A meaningful faith is one that is worthy of our examination, our trust, and answers the deepest longings of our heart. Skeptics, doubters, seekers are welcome as we ask this big question. We don't have all the answers, but we know the one who does. Join us on this walk as we search for a worthy faith. I was listening to a radio debate a few years ago between a believer and an atheist. And the atheist said, "All right, you go first. Prove to me that God exists." How would you answer that? I suppose if it was me, I would want to do some work on the question first. You see, the word proof is problematic. I hear it a lot, but you need to think about how that might come across. The first problem has to do with how we come to know things. When a detective or a scientist in a laboratory wants to prove something, they're looking for clues in the universe. They're pointing to an object in the universe that can't be denied. You can see it, you can taste it, you can touch it, and it's just illogical and without foundation not to believe in it. We call that proof. The truth is, very few things that we really value in this life holds up to the weight of something like that. I can't prove to you that I won't get in a car accident on the way home from church. But not only do I drive, I put the most precious people in the world in the car with me. And I can't prove that it's right to love my neighbor and wrong to hate my neighbor. But it's foundational to how I live my life. My guess is it is for you too. And I know that the textbooks tell me that scientists have proved all sorts of theorems that I learned in school. But I couldn't lay the proof for them in front of you if you put a gun to my head. I rely on testimony. There are people I trust. It's how I live my life. The hard rationalism that says never believe anything unless you have 100% scientific confirmation is not credible, it's not livable, and it's not actually how we go about living our lives. So the first problem with proof is the way we come to know things. The other problem is when it comes to God. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to actually travel into space. A Russian cosmonaut. He came back, and according to reports, he reportedly said, "There is no God. I went out in space, and I looked to look for him, and I didn't see him." A crass response was somebody said, "Well, if you had got out of your spacesuit, you would have." That's not a great answer. I think C.S. Lewis had a better one. C.S. Lewis heard about that, and he said, that's like asking Hamlet to go up to his attic and look for Shakespeare. What? If you were to ask Hamlet, where is Shakespeare? The right answer is everywhere. This is all Shakespeare. But what test tube in Hamlet's basement would produce Shakespeare? Where could you point in order to say, there is Shakespeare? He's not an object in the play. He's the author of it. I think that's why Augustine, years ago, said God's not just some great being at the end of a cosmic chain. He's not just the biggest thing in the room. He's not just a being, he's being itself. And I think that's why another quote from Lewis is really helpful when we think about God. He was talking about Christianity, but I think we can change Christianity to God and make the same point. I believe in God like I believe in the sun. Not just because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Isn't that a great quote? To believe in God is to believe that meaning and purpose are real and available. To believe love has an ultimate source. To believe truth has an objective ground. And justice isn't just what one society thinks it is. I think this is why a common tactic often used by atheists in debates falls flat. They'll begin by saying something like this. You ever heard of Zeus? Ever heard of Thor? There are 100,000 gods people have believed in over the years. You don't believe in those, do you? Okay, so when I say I don't believe in the Christian God, that just means I believe in one less God than you do. Sounds good, doesn't it? And that would be a great argument if all we're talking about is the next thing to put on the shelf. But that's not what we're talking about. When we talk about God, Thomas Aquinas said, when we're talking about God, what we're saying is, do you believe in love? Do you believe in goodness? Do you believe there's truth in the world? Do you believe that beauty is a real thing? Those are names for God. It just so happens he's also personal and sent Jesus to show us. I think sometimes some Christian apologists have been smug and overconfident. They speak about God as if he's just outside the door, and if you take 3 steps out that door and follow my argument, you'll see him. You'll run right into him. And then if you deny him, it means you're denying reality. You should go to the insane asylum. It's just so obvious. I don't think that. I don't think that's generous to the host of non-believers who are careful, critical thinkers, who love their families, who are good citizens, who help make the world a better place, who ask good questions. The fact that non-belief is on the rise should give us pause and challenge us before we are just dismissive of people who say such things. But on the other hand, I do think that smugness and closed-mindedness is not entirely on one side. I really appreciate Thomas Nagel, who's neither smug nor closed-minded, but confessional. Listen to this quote. I'm talking about the fear of religion itself. I speak from experience, being strongly subject to this fear myself. I want atheism to be true. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. And after this stunning confession, he challenges us all. I'm curious whether there is anyone who is genuinely indifferent as to whether there is a God. Anyone who, whatever his actual belief about the matter, doesn't particularly want either one of the answers to be correct. Go back to my opening story. Prove to me that God exists. I'm all ears. The believer thought for a second and said, okay, let me ask you a question. What evidence would you accept as evidence for God? Well, the non-believer thought for a second and said, well, to come to think of it, there is nothing you could say or do. There is nothing you could show me that would cause me to believe that God exists. And the believer said, do you see the problem? You want me to bring you evidence that God exists, but you're convinced there is no evidence that could show you that God exists. How in the world are we supposed to have a conversation? I think it's a good question. If we're honest, we interpret facts on the ground through the lens we've already chosen. We need to realize that good detective work doesn't start with the evidence we want to have in front of us, but with the evidence we actually have in front of us. And it doesn't help if I tell you I've got a secret code and you don't have it, and I will consider evidence that already fits into my system, but nothing else. No, I think what helps is if we say, let's look at the same thing. Let's look at the evidence in front of us, and let's just see what it points to. And that's why I like to use the language of clues. Clues that point me to the story that defines my life. And the first big question that confronts me is this: why is there something rather than nothing? The clue that points me to God is when I consider the world. Open just about any science textbook nowadays, And there will be at least a chapter on the origins of the universe. You heard that right. Origins. Wasn't always that way. There have been theories, even in our own century early on, about the infinite age of the universe, or the fact that we have had a steady state situation. In other words, there was no beginning to the universe, but that's not the case anymore in any science textbook. You see, Albert Einstein went to the chalkboard and he started putting his theory of general relativity up on the board, and he came to the conclusion that if this theory works out right, we're living in an expanding universe, one that is growing outward away from everything else. Did you know that in 1929, Edwin Hubble, whose name is attached to that Hubble telescope, those beautiful pictures we've seen lately, confirmed what Einstein had theorized? He looked through his telescope and he looked in every direction. The wavelength of light was getting stretched, which means everything is moving out away from everything else. The galaxies are moving out at about 1 million miles per hour. Now, reverse the picture. If things are moving away from each other, it means there was a point at which things were actually all put together. And that has been called the origin of the universe. Now, it's interesting to me why this should come up, because for years, we're talking for centuries, there's been an argument called the Kalam cosmological argument, and it goes like this. If something begins to exist, then it has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. In 1978, Robert Jastrow, there we go. In 1978, Robert Jastrow wrote a book, and he said, I want you to know some things about me. I helped start a NASA project. I ran the Goddard Institute. When we had the Apollo mission in 1969, 10 years later, they wanted somebody to come on the Today Show to talk about that mission. This is the guy they picked. He knows his stuff. He said, I want you to know, I know what I'm talking about. The astronomical evidence proves that the universe began at some definite point in time. He then said, I want you to know something else. I'm an agnostic. Don't ask me if there's a God or not. I can't answer that question. I'm an agnostic. And yet he titled his book, God and the Astronomers. And the reason why he titled his book that is because of this argument. Think about it with me. If, in fact, there was a beginning to the universe, it cries out for an explanation. What in the world could have begun the universe? And if it's something itself that was caused, then what began that thing? And ultimately, you have to go back to something that is uncaused, something that is the source of all power and energy, something that is the source of all knowledge and beauty, something that is the source of all goodness and power. And the only thing that fits that definition is what we have always meant by God. Just take a look, for example, at the second law of thermodynamics. We find that in any closed system, things tend to move towards disorder. And yet, even though the sun is producing 600 million tons of hydrogen every single second, the sun still has 98% of its fuel. If things are running down irreversibly, the second law says that there was a time when everything was wound up. It challenges any other model of an infinite universe. It says the universe must have had a beginning, and that's why astrobiologist Paul Davies, also not a believer, says, I'll guarantee you one thing. The universe had a beginning. It makes me ask the question, what does that imply? Sir Arthur Eddington, also not a believer, says, when you look at the fact that the universe is expanding and therefore it must have had a beginning, I feel an indignation that anyone should believe in it except myself. The beginning seems to present insuperable difficulties unless we agree to look on it as, frankly, supernatural. In debates about science and religion, it seems like everybody really wants to talk about how things developed. But I find the much more interesting question, how in the world did anything get started? In fact, there's something called the fine-tuning argument. And it says those initial conditions, the things that were put into place at the very beginning, must have been so carefully put together that it screams somebody designed it. I want you to think about this with me. The phrase fine-tuning is not a Christian term. That's the subtitle of a book published just 2 years ago from Cambridge University Press by an astrophysicist who's not a believer, calling the universe finely tuned. So what are the chances that everything in the universe was put together in just the right way? The odds are astronomically low. I want to explain it to you. Suppose that I flipped a coin and I said, please tell me if it's going to be heads or tails. You have a 50% chance of getting that right. That's 1 out of 2. Now, if I flip it again and I say, okay, can you guess it right twice in a row? That's 1 out of 2 times 1 out of 2. That's 1 out of 4. Well, 3 times in a row, you got to multiply again. Now the numbers get larger. Now it's 1 out of 8. Do you see how the numbers get exponentially higher? In fact, the number can get so big that if I say, can you guess 100 times in a row, that's 1 with 30 zeros after it. That number up there. That's too big to write. It's too big to say. I was going to look up how to say that just to try to impress you, but I forgot. 1 with 30 zeros after it. So the way that scientists give that number is they say the chances are 1 in 10 to the 30th power. If you want to know how big these power numbers are, let me give you some examples. The number of seconds in 10 billion years is 1 to 10 to the 17th power. Or how about the distance across the universe in inches? That's 10 to the 28th power. Do you understand that when you add 1 more power, it's exponentially bigger than the number before it? Somebody calculated the number of things in the universe. We're talking about electrons, protons, neutrons. Put them all together. How many things are there in the universe? 10 to the 80th power. That's how many particles there are in the known universe that we are aware of. I want you to understand how big these numbers are. Because just a few years ago, Oxford published a book in which they tried to state what are the chances that we got a ball of rock in the right place in the universe and that we have the right distance between the planets and the right distance between the Earth and the sun. That if you change 1 degree in terms of the distance, if you change 1 bit of the amount of mass that we have, for example, in an electron. If you change, for example, the density or the amount of hydrogen in the universe, if you change just a smidgen of the distance between the planets and the distance of the planet to the sun, the numbers are astronomical in terms of what kind of universe we would or wouldn't have. So the physicist Lee Smolin calculated the odds of life-compatible numbers and said that's 1 in 10 to the 229th power. That's this number. I want you to understand what I'm talking about. Just 2 years ago, Scientific American wrote an article about this book and said, look, some people look at this number and they say, it's so astronomically impossible, there must be another explanation. And people are now saying, Alan Guth, for example, that we have a multiverse. And in the Scientific American article, they say, what is the evidence for that? 0. But it's a hypothesis that seems to make the most sense of all the things that we can see. There's no proof for it, but we're trying to make sense of what we see. Tell me again why God is not allowed as an option on the table? If you were to jump out of a plane at 10,000 feet without a parachute, do you know what your odds are of surviving the fall? 1 in 10 to the 10th power. You wouldn't bet your life. I don't bet my soul. Not on numbers like this. Henry Lipson was talking about how things originally started. A British physicist, not a believer. He says, if you're talking about how things originally began, dead matter did not give rise to live matter. Living matter is not caused by the interplay of atoms, natural forces, and radiation. So how did it come into being? I think we have to admit the only acceptable alternative is that somehow it was created. I know this is anathema to physicists, as indeed it is to me. But we must not reject a theory that we don't like if the experimental evidence supports it. The second big question that I'm confronted with is this: where do objective moral values come from? And the clue that points me to God is that when I consider the human being, I'm drawn to ask, how in the world could this not point to an ultimate standard or source that I call God? You know, a person can choose to live their life by any standard they wish, but moral obligation, the idea that you need to live by the same standard that I live by, and you are wrong because I believe you're wrong, and you ought to acknowledge that, can only work if there's a higher system to which you and I are both accountable. But it seems to me that if God doesn't exist, then objective moral values don't exist. It was Dostoevsky who said, if there is no God, then everything is permissible. He was stating a fairly obvious conclusion. There is no lawful requirement where there is no law giver. Nietzsche thought so. Bertrand Russell said that morality arises from a herd of people. So a certain gathering of folks can decide what is right and wrong, but there's no moral obligation outside of that particular group. Michael Roos said, you think of something really awful like rape. Well, we all know that's wrong, but suppose we found living beings on Andromeda. Why would we think that it's wrong there? You see, society decides what is right and what is wrong. We don't live this way. You remember the story I told you last week where Dr. Warren asked Dr. Flew, what law did the Nazis violate when they put kids in boxcars coated with quicklime to die an agonizing death? And Dr. Flew said, there's a law that Nuremberg applied to, a higher law. And that's true. But at Nuremberg, they said there's a law that transcends time and place. But where's that come from? Nietzsche and Russell and Roos and Skinner said there's no such thing if there is no God. If God doesn't exist, objective moral values don't exist. But it sure seems like objective moral values do exist. I know the phrase cancel culture is all the rage. And I'm sure you have strong feelings about it. Pro or con. But I'm interested in what lies at the heart of something like that. By cancel culture, I mean if somebody finds out you did something they don't think is right, and it can go back as far back as when you were just a teenager, or maybe a century ago. If we find something out about you that I don't think is right, then I can treat you as morally accountable for it. Even if the society in which you were raised didn't think that was wrong, if I think it's wrong, you are to be held accountable by that standard. Here's my question. The only way to justify any sort of appeal like that is if there's some objective standard of right and wrong that transcends place and time. Take something like stealing or murder. Animals take things in nature, but we don't call that stealing. Some creatures eat other creatures. We don't call that murder. We seem to think human life is inherently valuable. Human liberty is sacrosanct. Rights are important and ought to be respected. Where do you have any standard to believe that? What about love and beauty and music? Why do they touch me in ways that physical science can't? There's a man named A.N. Wilson you should get to know. An Oxford grad who went to school with Richard Dawkins, one of the new atheists. Wilson was a cerebral writer who absolutely opposed any sense of God. He wrote a book called Against Religion, Why We Should Try to Live Without It. But in 2009, he shocked his colleagues and friends when he wrote an article that appeared in the New Statesman called Why I Believe Again. He couldn't shake a nagging doubt, a doubt about his doubts. He called his move to atheism a conversion experience and says, but I had periods of doubt about my doubts. He says, I was drawn over and over again to the disconcerting recognition that so very many of the people I had most admired and loved, either in life or in books, had been believers. He said, take a look at, for example, at Gandhi's life. It focused on God so deeply and reminded me of all the human qualities that have to be denied if you embrace the bleak, muddled creed of a materialist atheist. It's like trying to assert that music is an aberration, and that although Bach and Beethoven are very impressive, you're better off without a musical sense. It says, think about language. Think about how language moves us, how a particular set of grunts forms sounds, and those sounds form words, and those words form sentences that change civilization. Think about music, how certain sounds partnering with certain other sounds in the right hands of the composer bring us to our knees and touch the deepest parts of humanity. Wilson says, human beings are so much more than a collection of meat. We're spiritual beings. And that's why he quotes Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who said, when Genesis claims that man became a living soul, it just seems all obviously true, and materialism can never explain what that means. The last question that confronts me is this: how do you explain the power and rise of Christianity? And the clue that points me to God is what I see when I consider the story that defines my life. There were other great sages and teachers, but never did man speak like this man spoke. Teaching the way is up is down, the way forward is through surrender. The teaching that the good life is not found in money or power or fame, but in loving service to your fellow man and in glorifying God. There was no great regard for children in the ancient world before Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me and don't hinder them." The early Christians took notice, raising unwanted children in their homes, becoming known in the 2nd century as the people that don't destroy their offspring. They were known for going into circles painted in the streets that were put there for unwanted children and raising them as their own. There was no organized charity effort in the ancient world before Jesus taught the parable of the Good Samaritan and demanded that his followers put it in practice. The early Christians took notice. They created the first hospitals in the 3rd century. In fact, it was 4 centuries later before another hospital was created, and that was by Muslims who were also believers in God. It was not a coincidence that the abolition leaders in England, like William Wilberforce, and the racial equality demanders in the U.S., like MLK, were ministers. Jesus' teaching didn't just change, it revolutionized the world. There were other great movements and empires in history, but nothing with the kind of profound influence on the world like the church. Western civilization owes a great deal of gratitude to Christianity. The first universities were established by believers wanting to explore God's good world. The printing press was created because the Bible needed to be read. The scientific revolution was at the hands of worshiping believers. How do you explain the rise of the Christian movement, led by fishermen and prostitutes, former tax collectors and lepers, orphans, who take on Caesar's empire and conquer it by love? I'm simply asking if you would consider doubting your doubts, if you would consider if the clues in the universe point to something so deep, something that connects with the longings of our heart that we talked about last week. Our soul cries out for something more, something beyond, something deeper, and something better. And not only does that something better exist, He is a person who loves you, who sent His Son to die for you, and wants you to be with Him forever.
Thank you for joining us. I hope you've been encouraged. I hope you've been enriched. And if you have any questions, any thoughts, any comments, reach out to us at prayers@wschurch.net. God bless you Tune in next week.